Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive. We're going to be looking at Black Matriarchy.
Okay.
We've got some academic excerpts here about ancient African societies and
Yeah.
a blog post that is really interesting that talks about perceptions of Black motherhood in America.
Right.
And so I'm really excited to kind of get into this.
Yeah, me too. This will be fun.
And right off the bat, this blog post kind of dives into this whole idea of Black matriarchy being, a misconception rooted in it says ugly ideologies. Is that basically saying that this whole thing is just false?
Well, I mean, it's definitely more complicated than that.
Right.
You know, it's not as simple as just true or false.
Right.
This idea that Black women are somehow dominating their families and, emasculating men, that idea has been used to justify some pretty terrible things in history.
So this is more than just a misunderstanding?
Yeah.
This is about using history to control people.
Absolutely.
And the blog post mentions this historian, Philip A. Bruce, and this harmful Jezebel stereotype.
Yeah.
Is that part of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, for sure. Bruce, unfortunately, his work kind of helped to set the stage for, things like lynchings.
Wow.
He painted this picture of Black women as being hypersexual and then blamed them for the, supposed moral failings of Black men.
Right.
And that stereotype is something that we still see the negative impacts of today.
Man, that's really intense. And it doesn't end there.
No.
The blog post talks about Daniel Patrick Moynihan back in 1965, released this report, The Negro Family.
Yeah.
And seems to kind of place the blame for poverty on Black women.
Yeah.
Can you explain that? What did he get wrong?
We see Moynihan, he noticed that a lot of Black households were headed by single mothers.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of looking at, the systemic issues that were causing this, things like, discrimination in housing or jobs or education, he decided that the family structure itself
was the root cause of poverty.
So he was saying that because there were more Black families that were single mother led, that was the cause of the poverty.
That's exactly it.
And not all these other factors that are pushing down on them.
Yeah. It's like, classic blaming the victim rather than acknowledging the systems in place that were keeping people from succeeding.
And it's kind of scary to think that these ideas are still floating around today.
Oh, absolutely.
The blog post talks about the welfare queen stereotype and how it plays into this.
Mm-hmm.
But also points out that most people on welfare are actually white.
Right.
So how did this image of the welfare queen become so powerful?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it gets to the heart of how stereotypes work,
Yeah.
Even though the data shows most welfare recipients are white.
Right.
This image of, the lazy Black woman taking advantage of the system.
Right.
It's stuck around.
Yeah.
And it got used to justify cuts.
To social programs that were actually helping Black communities.
It's, and they use Linda Taylor, the story of her in the blog post, to show how, one case can be twisted to fit a narrative. It's clear we need to be really aware of these stereotypes and how they can get used against groups of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about, not denying that there are challenges, but understanding the bigger picture and the systems that create those challenges.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how Black families have actually been structured throughout history.
Okay.
The blog post mentions that some West African cultures practiced matrilineality.
Right.
What does that even mean?
So matrilineality basically means that family lineage and inheritance are traced through the mother's side of the family instead of the father's.
Okay.
And that system definitely gave women a certain level of influence and status within their communities. It's important to understand that it didn't mean that those societies were matriarchies. Men still held a lot of power in those pre-colonial African cultures.
So it's not as simple as saying Africa was all matriarchal before colonization.
Exactly. It's way more nuanced than that. And we see that reflected in the academic excerpts we have here. It talks about how women were revered in many ancient African societies.
Yeah.
Think about the role of queens and priestesses as spiritual leaders.
Yeah.
There was veneration of female deities associated with creation, fertility, and wisdom.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's really fascinating. It challenges the whole idea that, women in Africa have always been oppressed and powerless.
Yeah, there was a real diversity of experiences across the continent.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have the arrival of slavery,
Right.
which just shattered family structures and denied Black people basic human rights,
Yeah.
like the right to marry.
Yep.
You know, it's impossible to overstate the devastating impact that this had on the development of Black families in America.
It's heartbreaking to think about how families were like ripped apart and women were exploited through these horrific breeding programs.
Yeah.
It really highlights the strength and resilience of Black families, that they were able to maintain any sense of kinship and community despite these horrific circumstances.
Absolutely. And this context is vital to understanding why Black families in America developed differently than the traditional nuclear family model that we often see portrayed as the norm.
Yeah.
They relied on extended family networks and strong community bonds to survive and resist the dehumanizing forces of slavery.
Yeah. And that historical context makes me wonder, like, how did these, resilient families adapt economically? Because the blog post mentions that Black women have historically worked outside the home, which seems like kind of a shift from those pre-colonial African societies.
It is, and unfortunately, it was often out of pure necessity.
Yeah.
You know, Black women had to work to help their families survive.
Right.
But what made things even worse were discriminatory economic policies and law enforcement practices that disproportionately targeted Black men. And this meant that Black women often became the primary breadwinners in their families.
Right.
And this, as you can imagine, played right into the myth of Black matriarchy.
Right. It's almost like they were set up to fail.
Yeah.
You know, they're forced into these roles out of necessity, and then that's used against them to perpetuate these stereotypes.
Yeah. And to make matters worse, a lot of the data on Black marriage and motherhood is actually misleading. Many databases don't accurately reflect the prevalence of cohabiting couples and non-married families, which are common among Black communities.
Right.
So it's really important to be critical of the information we're consuming and to understand the full context before jumping to conclusions.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that statistics don't always tell the whole story. We need to dig a little deeper and understand those nuances of Black family structures.
It's about recognizing the historical forces that have shaped these families, the challenges they faced, and the incredible resilience they've shown.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we have.
We haven't really touched on the contributions of African women throughout history.
Right.
The academic excerpts kind of hint at it, but can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so while original matriarch might be a bit of an oversimplification, there's no denying that women were highly regarded in many ancient African societies. They held positions of spiritual leadership. They played vital roles in community life.
Right.
And were often seen as symbols of creation and wisdom.
That's a far cry from the narrative that we often get pushed about African women being, solely victims of patriarchal oppression.
Exactly.
It sounds like they held a lot of power and influence.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember the diversity of experiences across the African continent. You know, different cultures had different social structures. Yeah. But there are undeniable examples of women holding significant power and influence. For example, the academic excerpts mention matrilineal inheritance. And while these systems didn't necessarily grant women full political power, they definitely underscored their importance in family and community.
It really challenges our, modern westernized view of what female leadership looked like.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, a lot of that history gets overshadowed by colonial narratives that paint a very different picture.
Yeah, exactly.
So that brings us to the impact of colonialism on the roles of women in African societies.
Right.
This feels like a pivotal moment where things start to shift.
Yeah.
How did European powers reshape those existing gender dynamics?
Well, European colonization imposed patriarchal structures on many African societies. You know, they introduced monogamous marriage as the norm, established male-dominated governance systems, and created economic systems that marginalized women.
Wow.
It was a systematic dismantling of the existing systems that empowered women.
It's almost like they went out of their way to erase the contributions and influence of African women.
And to add insult to injury, they justified it by claiming that European culture was more civilized and their patriarchal structures were superior.
Wow.
You know, it's a textbook example of cultural imperialism.
It's a tragic example of how colonialism disrupted existing power structures and imposed new forms of oppression.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the introduction of Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Islam,
Right.
while having diverse interpretations, often introduced patriarchal frameworks that clashed with pre-existing traditions.
Yeah.
It's like they were hit with this triple whammy of oppression,
Yeah.
political, economic, and religious.
It's a complex and often heartbreaking history. But understanding this context is essential to understanding the ongoing challenges faced by Black women today.
And that brings us to the modern era. We've talked about the myths surrounding Black matriarchy and delved into the historical and economic factors that have shaped Black family structures.
Right.
But how does all this connect to the oppression that Black women continue to face today?
Well, that's where the concept of intersectionality becomes crucial.
Okay.
This term, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, helps us understand how different forms of oppression, like racism and sexism, don't exist in isolation. They overlap and intersect, creating unique challenges for Black women who experience the combined burdens of both.
So it's not just about being Black or being a woman.
Right.
It's about the ways that those identities come together.
Exactly.
And create, like, a whole new set of obstacles.
Exactly. And we see this reflected in the persistence of harmful stereotypes.
Right.
The economic disadvantages Black women face, and the limited opportunities they are often afforded.
It's a reminder that we can't talk about racism or sexism in a vacuum.
Right.
We need to understand how these systems work together to create and maintain inequality.
And it's important to remember that Black women are not a monolithic group. You know, they have diverse experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives, but they are united by the shared burden of intersectional oppression.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we have.
What are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should be thinking about?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand that Black matriarchy is not a simple concept.
Right.
It's a term that's loaded with misinformation and historical baggage.
Right.
It's been used to both celebrate and denigrate Black women, often at the same time.
Wow.
So, you know, we need to move beyond these oversimplified narratives and engage with the nuances of Black family structures and the real-life experiences of Black women.
So it's about understanding the historical forces that have shaped these families, acknowledging their strength and resilience, and actively working to dismantle the systems of oppression that continue to hold them back.
Absolutely. And it's about amplifying the voices and experiences of Black women themselves. You know, they are the experts on their own lives and their own families.
This has been a really eye-opening,
deep
dive so far.
Yeah, it has.
Thank you for sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure.
I think our listener has a lot to process.
I always appreciate the opportunity to unpack these complex issues and hopefully inspire some, critical thinking.
Speaking of critical thinking, it's striking to me how the historical erasure of African women's contributions feeds into the narrative of their subjugation. It's almost like by silencing their stories and achievements, we make it easier to perpetuate this idea that they've always been oppressed and powerless.
That's a great point.
Right.
And that's why it's so crucial to reclaim and celebrate those contributions. You know, we need to challenge the dominant narratives that have marginalized African women and highlight their agency, their strength, their resilience.
I love that. Reclaiming those narratives.
Yeah.
It feels so empowering.
It is empowering.
It's about recognizing that Black women have always been active agents in shaping their own destinies and the course of history.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the past. It's about understanding how those historical legacies continue to shape the present and inform the future.
So how do we bridge that gap between that historical context and the modern realities faced by Black women today?
Well, for starters, we need to be more critical of the sources we consume and the information we share. You know, are we perpetuating harmful stereotypes or amplifying authentic voices?
Yeah.
Are we acknowledging the diversity of experiences within Black communities or are we clinging to monolithic narratives?
Those are, such important questions to ask.
Yeah.
It's about being mindful of the language we use, the images we share, and the stories we tell.
Right.
And it's about being willing to listen
Mm-hmm.
and learn from Black women themselves.
Absolutely.
They are the experts on their own lives and their own experiences.
So much of this comes down to amplifying those voices.
Yeah,
And creating space for them to be heard.
absolutely. So this is a reminder that it's not just about understanding history, it's about taking action.
Right.
To create a more just and equitable future.
It is. And
Yes.
that action can take many forms.
Right.
You know, it can be about supporting organizations that are led by and serve Black women.
Mm-hmm.
It can be about advocating for policies
Right.
that address the specific challenges they face. It can be about educating ourselves and others about the realities of intersectional oppression.
And it can be as simple as having those uncomfortable conversations with friends and family members.
Those conversations are crucial.
Right.
They can be challenging, but they're absolutely essential to creating real change.
Yeah, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of this issue and the importance of approaching it with nuance and sensitivity.
I'm glad to hear that.
And I think that's the biggest takeaway here, is that Black matriarchy is not a simple concept.
Right.
It's a multifaceted historical and social phenomenon that demands, careful consideration
Yeah,
and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
absolutely.
It's about understanding the historical context, cultural nuances, the economic realities, and the ongoing struggles faced by Black women today.
Right.
And it's about honoring their strength, their resilience, and their contributions to society.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for our listener?
Well, I think the most important thing is to continue learning and unlearning.
Right.
To be critical of the information we encounter, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to be open to challenging our own biases.
And to remember that this is an ongoing conversation.
It is.
There's always more to learn and more work to be done.
Absolutely. This is not a one-time deep dive.
Right.
It's a lifelong commitment to understanding and dismantling the systems of oppression
Right.
that impact Black women in all marginalized communities.
So, with that in mind, what's one final thought-provoking question we can leave our listener with?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
How about this? How can we move beyond simply acknowledging the historical contributions of African women and start actively reclaiming and celebrating those legacies in ways that empower Black women today?
That's a powerful question.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think about how we can translate our understanding of the past into tangible actions that create a more just and equitable present.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond passive observation
Right.
and engaging in meaningful ways that honor the past while shaping the future.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you again for sharing your expertise and for helping us navigate this complex
Oh, my pleasure.
and important topic.
And thank you to our listener for joining us
Yeah.
on this deep dive.
We've covered so much ground, but I want to circle back to where we started.
Okay.
This myth of Black matriarchy.
Yeah, a myth that has been used to justify so much harm and discrimination.
Yeah, you're right. And it's been really eye-opening to explore all the historical, economic, and cultural nuances that debunk this myth. It's clear that it's not only inaccurate, but incredibly damaging.
It perpetuates harmful stereotypes,
Yeah.
ignores systemic factors,
Yeah.
and ultimately undermines the agency and strength of Black women.
So if we know this is a harmful myth, how do we fight back against it? How can we promote a more accurate and empowering understanding of Black families and communities?
Well, it all starts with awareness. We have to take a hard look at our own biases and assumptions and ask ourselves if we're unconsciously subscribing to the stereotypes
Right.
that have been ingrained in our culture.
It's a tough but necessary first step.
It is.
And what about after that? What can we do to actively challenge this myth?
We need to be critical of the information we consume and the language we use.
Okay.
And we need to actively seek out diverse perspectives and amplify the voices of Black women themselves.
Right.
They are the experts on their own experiences, their own families, and their own communities.
It's about shifting that power dynamic, isn't it?
It is.
Giving Black women the platform to tell their own stories and share their own truths.
Absolutely.
And we can't forget about intersectionality.
Right.
Black women face unique challenges at the crossroads of racism and sexism.
Right.
So we need to understand how those forces intersect and actively work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that this isn't just about changing individual attitudes, but about creating systemic change.
Absolutely.
And that requires collective action.
It does.
You know, we can support organizations led by and serving Black women, advocate for policies that address their specific needs, and hold ourselves and each other accountable for creating a more just and equitable world.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
Yeah, me too.
And thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I feel like I've learned so much, and I hope our listener feels the same way.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm glad to hear that.
This has been great.
And I hope it inspires our listener to continue exploring,
Yeah.
learning, and engaging with this issue in meaningful ways.
So as we wrap up, what's one final thought you want to leave our listener with?
I would say this. Black matriarchy is a myth, but the strength, resilience, and contributions of Black women are undeniable realities. Let's honor their legacies, amplify their voices, and work together to create a world where they can thrive.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
And on that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.
It's amazing how much we covered already, but
Yeah.
I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this whole idea of Black matriarchy. It's clear that it's more about these stereotypes and misconceptions than about reality, but I'm still wondering, where do we even go from here?
Yeah, it's true. We've only just begun to unravel this complex topic. And to your point, it's less about some rigid definition of Black matriarchy and more about understanding the real experiences of Black families throughout history and today.
So if we want to move beyond these harmful stereotypes, what are some steps we can take? What can our listener do to start challenging those assumptions they might encounter?
Well, first off, I think it's crucial to be aware of the language we use.
Yeah.
Words have power.
Right.
And we need to be mindful of how we talk about Black families and Black women in particular. Are we reinforcing harmful stereotypes without even realizing it?
That's a good point. We need to be more conscious of the words we choose and the images we share and making sure we're not perpetuating those negative narratives. But it's not just about avoiding harmful language, right?
Right.
It's also about actively promoting a more accurate and empowering understanding of Black families.
You got it. We can't just sit back and hope things change on their own.
Right.
We need to actively seek out diverse perspectives and amplify the voices of Black women themselves. Let them tell their own stories, share their own proofs, and define their own experiences.
That's a powerful idea, letting Black women speak for themselves and take control of their own narratives. It seems like so much of this comes down to empowering them to define their own identities and dismantle the systems that try to limit them.
Exactly. And it's not just about giving them a platform. It's about truly listening to what they have to say, learning from their experiences and acknowledging the unique challenges they face at the intersection of racism and sexism.
So this idea of intersectionality, it's not just an academic term. It's a lived reality for Black women every day.
Absolutely. And recognizing that intersectionality is key to understanding how systemic inequalities impact their lives in unique and often devastating ways.
If we want to create real change, it's not enough to just understand history, right? We have to actively work to dismantle those systems of oppression.
Couldn't agree more. This goes beyond simply acknowledging the problem. It's about taking action.
So what does that action look like? What are some tangible steps our listener can take to be a part of that change?
There are so many ways to get involved, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. For one, we can support organizations that are led by and serve Black women. These organizations are on the ground doing incredible work to address the specific needs of their communities.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like supporting these organizations is something that anyone can do, regardless of their background or resources. But is there more we can do on like a policy level?
Absolutely. We can advocate for policies that address the specific challenges Black women face, like economic inequality, healthcare disparities, and the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system.
So it's about using our voices to demand change and holding our elected officials accountable for creating a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. And it's not just about big, sweeping policy changes. Sometimes the most impactful changes start on a smaller scale. What do you mean by that?
I mean, having those difficult conversations with friends and family members.
Who might be clinging to outdated or harmful stereotypes.
Right.
It can be uncomfortable, but it's crucial to challenge those beliefs and help people understand the harm they cause.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. It's like we can be activists in our own living rooms just by starting those conversations and educating those around us.
Precisely. Those conversations can be challenging, but they're absolutely essential to creating real, lasting change.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. It's made me realize how much I still have to learn about this topic and how important it is to approach it with nuance and sensitivity.
I'm so glad to hear that, and I hope it inspires our listener to continue exploring, learning, and engaging with this issue in meaningful ways.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that Black matriarchy isn't a simple concept. It's a multifaceted historical and social phenomenon that requires careful consideration and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Right.
It's about going beyond those oversimplified narratives and really engaging with the richness and complexity of Black families and Black women's experiences.
It's about understanding the historical context, the cultural nuances, the economic realities, and the ongoing struggles that Black women face today.
Yeah, and it's about honoring their strength.
Absolutely.
Their resilience and their contributions to society.
Beautifully said. And I think it's also about recognizing that this isn't a one-time conversation.
No.
This is a lifelong commitment to understanding and dismantling the systems of oppression that impact Black women and all marginalized communities.
So where do we go from here? What can our listener take away from this conversation and apply to their own lives?
I would say the most important thing is to continue learning and unlearning.
Okay.
To be critical of the information we encounter, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to be open to challenging our own biases. We have to stay engaged and keep the conversation going.
It's not about having all the answers, but about being willing to ask the tough questions and keep learning.
Exactly. And to remember that even small actions can make a difference, whether it's donating to an organization, signing a petition, or having a difficult conversation. Every step we take brings us closer to a more just and equitable world.
So with that in mind, is there one final thought-provoking question we can leave our listener with?
Ooh, that's a great idea.
Something to really ponder as they continue on their own learning journey.
How about this? How can we as individuals and as a society move beyond simply acknowledging the historical contributions of African women and start actively reclaiming and celebrating those legacies in ways that empower Black women today?
That's a powerful question.
Yeah.
It challenges us to translate our understanding of the past into tangible actions that create a more just and equitable present.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond passive observation and engaging in meaningful ways that honor the past while shaping the future. We can't just talk about change. We have to be the change.
That's such an inspiring message.
Thank you.
And on that note, I want to thank you again for sharing your expertise and helping us navigate this incredibly complex and important topic.
The pleasure is all mine. And thank you to our listener for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you found it as enlightening and thought-provoking as we have.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this idea of reclaiming those powerful narratives about Black women throughout history.
Yeah.
It's almost like by shining a light on their achievements and contributions, we're chipping away at that monolithic myth of the Black matriarch.
That's such a powerful image, shining a light on those hidden histories.
Right.
It reminds us that Black women have always been agents of change, shaping their destinies and influencing the course of history.
Exactly. And it makes me wonder, how can we as individuals play a role in amplifying those voices and celebrating those legacies in a way that truly honors their impact?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that learning about these histories isn't just a one-time event. It's an ongoing journey of discovery and unlearning.
Right.
We need to be constantly seeking out new information, challenging our assumptions, and listening to diverse perspectives, especially those of Black women themselves.
It's about being open to having our minds changed.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And realizing that, we might not always have the right answers
Right.
or the full picture.
And part of that is being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations with people in our lives who might be clinging to outdated or harmful beliefs.
Yeah.
It's about gently challenging those stereotypes and helping them see the world through a different lens.
It's about being an ally, not just in words, but in actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking up when we see injustice and using our platforms to amplify the voices of those who are often silenced.
Exactly. And remember, allyship isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, being willing to learn, and using our privilege to support those who are fighting for equality.
So for our listener who's been on this journey with us today, what's one final thought you want to leave them with?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
What can they do to continue this learning process and become a more informed and engaged advocate?
Yeah.
I would say this: stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay open to the richness and complexity of Black experiences.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
So to wrap things up, I think we can all agree that the myth of Black matriarchy is just that, a myth.
It is.
But the strength, resilience, and contributions of Black women are undeniable realities.
Right.
Let's honor their legacies, amplify their voices, and work together to create a world where they can thrive.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome.
And thank you to our listener for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you so much for listening.
We hope you found it as enlightening and thought-provoking as we have.
Absolutely.
See you next time.
Bye.